Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's William Gibson, and I've been your host from the start of this year. And this is actually my last episode with you all today. So, a massive thank you to all of you for listening to the last few episodes that I've had the privilege and joy of hosting. And thank you to JPIT for the opportunity to be able to speak with some incredible guests. And make sure you go back and listen to some of our previous episodes because there's some absolute gold in all of those. But for today, our guest is Al Barrett. So, Al, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you on.
Thank you, William. Looking forward to being here.
So, the Revd Dr Al Barrett has been rector of Hodge Hill Church, which is a Church of England and United Reformed Church local ecumenical partnership in East Birmingham since 2010. He's been involved in long term journeys of intergenerational community building with neighbours in the council estate where he lives and pursuing racial justice and creation care within and beyond the local church community. Al seeks to engage in earthed, collaborative theological work in the intersections of church, mission, race, class, gender, and ecology, and is also in training to be a wild therapy practitioner. So Al co-wrote with Ruth Harley Being Interrupted, Reimagining the Church's Mission from the Outside, co-edited with Anthony Reddy and Jill Marsh Towards a Critical White Theology, and co-wrote with Simon Sutcliffe Trauma, Decomposing Masculinities and Ensoiled Christologies, or How Men Might Face and Follow Their Shit in Will Rose Moore's For Nothing is Hidden, Masculinities and Trauma in Church and Theology. Some things to add to my reading list there, Al, which I'm looking forward to getting into. And also joining us from JPIT today is Erica Lee Smith, JPIT's communications intern. Erica, it's good to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice to be back talking on this side of the recording again.
Yeah, good to have you. Al, let's start with a question that we ask everyone. Does politics belong in the pulpit?
I mean, obviously, my answer is yes, but I think for a couple of reasons. So, I think politics at its root is about how we navigate power and how we build relationships in a common life together, how we share stuff, how we share place, how we share the land that we live on, how we share the resources that we're entrusted with. And I think all of that is God stuff. All of that is what God gifts us and what God invites us to negotiate. And I think Jesus is right in the middle of all of that, calling us to be wise and discerning in terms of how power operates, how we share stuff, and particularly with a concern to who loses out in the world that we know, and what might we do about that.
That's great. Thanks so much for that answer. So, before we get into our conversation today, let's just set some context. First of all, some of the news headlines just now, and these might not be relevant to you as you're preparing, depending how late you'll be preparing your sermon for Sunday or whatever you're going to be sharing, because everything is changing very quickly all the time, it seems, especially over the last few weeks. But currently, the Iran war expands to Beirut with the latest Israeli strikes. Scientists have discovered hedgehogs' hearing is far higher than the human range, which could help stop their decline. The passing of the House of Lords, or Hereditary Peers Bill, will abolish all remaining hereditary peer titles. And Downing Street will release hundreds of files on Peter Mandelson's appointment as the US ambassador today. Our lectionary readings for Sunday, the 15th of March, are 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 13, Psalm 23, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 to 14, John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. And our awareness days, we are still in Lent, it is Mothering Sunday for Sunday, the 15th of March, and it's the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. We're also still in Women's History Month for March, so something else to keep in mind. But with all of that at the top of your mind, let's get into some of the text. So, Al, let's first of all ask you, is there a passage that you would pick to preach from, or a theme across the lectionary texts that you would draw out?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably a bit of both, William. So definitely drawn to the gospel reading. Certainly where I am here, we've been tracing a journey through Lent of encounters and conversations between Jesus and someone else. And there's another one of these in this reading, his encounter with the man born blind and his parents and the religious leaders. But I think there's also a theme for me that comes out of that gospel reading that threads across the others around what does it mean to see and to not see?
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's dive straight into the gospel reading then. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41. So it is a chunky reading for whoever's going to be doing the Bible reading in your church service on Sunday. But yeah, Al, what did you take away from this passage?
Sure. So I think I guess I probably want to begin with a couple of cautions as we read a passage like this. And one of them comes from one of the people who taught me theology back at Queen's Foundation 25 years ago, Professor John Hull, who became blind during his life and wrote a lot of his theology from the perspective of someone who was blind. Um, and John was really clear that when he got to heaven, he didn't want to be able to see again. He didn't want his blindness to be taken away from him because it had become part of who he was. Um, and and I think when John read this passage back in the day when I was learning from him, he was really um, just wanted to sort of push back at Jesus a little bit and push back at John, the gospel writer, and just say something about actually let's be cautious about stories that seem like they're using disability or impairment to make a point.
Hmm.
Which in a sense Jesus feels it feels like Jesus is doing in this passage a little bit. He's using the man born blind and his healing to kind of have a go at the religious leaders. So I guess that's one of my cautions. I think another caution for me is, and this relates to the Ephesians passage particularly, kind of the darkness and light binary.
Yep.
And again, I've kind of learnt from my black theologian friends and teachers that although we often come across that kind of imagery in the Bible, um, that the binary is not as simple as that, and the danger of the darkness and light binary is that we kind of map that onto evil and good. Darkness is evil, light is good, um, and and both my black theologian friends and John Hull as a blind theologian um, taught me that actually there are treasures in darkness, as the Psalms put it, that actually there's a whole world that that thrives in the dark, the world that's underground, the world of the womb, the darkness of the earth, where life begins. So I think I just want to kind of trouble those things a bit as a beginning. So uh, let's enter into those themes, but just with a little bit of caution as well, and maybe a slightly richer perspective than the binary.
Yep.
Is that a helpful place to start?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I picked up on that, especially for the John passage, because I mean, in the very first couple of verses, you have people trying to say that blindness is a result of sin, which is obviously harmful in the way that it's presented. And then you have Jesus saying that actually it was so that God's works might be revealed in him, which from the perspective of disability theology is still an unhelpful viewpoint. So I think it's a great place to start because it's the first thing that comes up when you're reading it, I think, if
Mm.
you're aware of these types of issues.
Yeah, no, thank you. Um, but then I think kind of going on from there, this theme of kind of who is really blind, who is really sighted in this passage, I find fascinating. Um, and and that sense, as Jesus describes judgment as something that he brings that's about who gets to see and who doesn't. And obviously
Mm,
we're talking metaphorically rather than literally now. Um, but it rings bells for me with what we were reading in our church last Sunday, the story of Jesus and Nicodemus, where Jesus says to Nicodemus, "No one can see the kingdom of God unless they've been born again." Um, which certainly, which I read as something about us having to relearn a way of seeing the world so that can begin to see the kingdom
mm.
in our world, to see God's kingdom. And it kind of feels like it has parallels with Jesus's words in Matthew and Mark and Luke about becoming little children to be able to enter into the kingdom. That sense of having to go back and start again, to learn from scratch, to be able to see as God sees. And it feels like the man in the middle of the story, in a sense, literally has his eyes opened and can see for the first time, and can see things pretty instantly that the religious leaders clearly are oblivious to. And I guess that at his most positive, Jesus is inviting the religious leaders to start again as well, just like Nicodemus last week, to follow in the footsteps of this man who's just had his sight given to him. But I'm just conscious how hard it is for those of us in positions of power and status and privilege to do that humility, to be
Yeah.
able to say, I don't know, to be able to say, oh, maybe maybe I can't see clearly the reality of this situation. Maybe I need to go to people who look like they're less important than me, look like they're much further from the center of things than me, and maybe the truth is there. And that feels like a central challenge in this gospel reading from Jesus. And for any of us with any kind of status and power, that feels like a hard thing to hear.
Yeah, that makes me think of there's some work by Professor Kathy Black called a healing homiletic preaching and disability. And when she talks about this passage, she mentions how people tend to look past people who are disabled. They will maybe speak to the people that are with them. So you might think in this passage that Jesus would speak to the man's parents, which obviously happens, but like speaking directly to those with the lived experience of disability, for example, is one of the things that she brings up. And then also the fact that when people are bold and speak up for themselves, they're seen often as being too pushy or aggressive rather than as the sort of passive receivers that they're expected to be. And so they too experience rejection by faith communities, which is what we see here with the blind man in the passage. And so she offers two sort of ways that we could come to preaching this passage. One is to see Jesus as seeking out the man who had been born blind at the end of the narrative and exploring also how major life events lead to changes like loss of community and identity and the long road to developing a new community and identity. His whole life has been transformed in the process of meeting Jesus here. And there's a lot that's going to change, and his whole sense of identity will change too. Erica, is there anything else you would want to add for this passage here?
Yeah, I really appreciate how you introduced that in a very helpful, nuanced way. Because when I came to look at the readings for the Sunday, I was like, oh well, there's some interesting things here, but also it feels wrong not to acknowledge that side of things as well. So thank you for that. I think I picked up on a couple of other things that maybe link to some of the things that JPIT tries to look at, particularly thinking about kind of truth telling and perhaps the kind of blindness of today's religious and non-religious leaders, and not only kind of the need to speak truth to power as churches and as Christians, and as people interested in activism, but also around challenging some of the narratives that we see on social media. And with the rise of AI particularly, it's hard to be able to see what is truthful. So we've reached a point where everyone seems to doubt what they see all the time. I think there's a piece of research by More in Common about the 7 segments of Britain, and one of those groups that they identify in kind of today's society is the skeptical scrollers, who just don't trust anything that they see online anymore, but also are kind of stuck in this pattern of doom scrolling. And I think, that some of those themes really come out for me, as someone perhaps in that generation of people. But then, I mean, we also trying in our work through JPIT to combat some of that, particularly by speaking truth to power at the moment around our current campaign on refugee family reunion. So there are things that we can do to kind of try and overcome some of that blindness in our leaders. And then the other side of things, I was wondering about how the idea of blindness can help us to look at where we sit within politics, and like I was saying about our as people of privilege, and how we recognize perhaps our blind spots in our activism, and we kind of are humble and hold ourselves accountable in some of that work as well, whether that's kind of through more ethical living practices, or whether it's through supporting our communities better and being more integrated in those. So they were some of the things that kind of came out to me.
That's great.
Can I just jump back in on something that sparked from Erica? I love that piece about knowledge and what we trust and what we kind of take seriously these days, because it feels like that's quite central to the passage in terms of the religious leaders feel like they've got this expertise and they know what's going on, and actually the testimony of the man and then his parents in front of them doesn't really shift that. But actually there's something I'm really intrigued about the man himself. He's quite simplistic in terms of what he says he knows. Actually, all I know is there was this man Jesus, and he rubbed some mud on my eyes, and then I could see, and he just kind of keeps it to that quite simple. This is what I know, and actually, I'm really struck by that. Actually, that's embodied knowledge. That is about something that has been immensely tangible that's happened to him. Jesus spits on some earth and turns it into mud and rubs the man's eyes with it, and then he's able to see. And it feels to me like in this world that you described, Erica, of where we're increasingly attached to our screens, and where knowledge is kind of mediated through those electronic networks, actually where we go for that sense of embodied knowledge of I feel this with my body, I've experienced this with my body. And it feels like there's an invitation here as well for us to on one level actually put down our screens and go and seek out those embodied encounters with others, and with the wider world around us, with the modern human world as well. And just very briefly reminded me that last night I had the privilege of being invited to an iftar, a breaking of the fast, at our local hotel that houses asylum seekers. And I sat on the floor with a young man from Afghanistan, who was a Muslim, who had prayed before we ate, along with many of his fellow residents in the hotel, and then sat down next to me and said, if only those of us who call ourselves religious could spend more time loving God and loving our neighbour, then the world would be a better place. And you know, it was one of those moments, and I, on one level it's a cliche, but actually from him in that encounter, sitting on the floor together, breaking our fast together, actually just felt like one of those moments of truth telling that you
Yeah.
talked about. And I wish more people had those opportunities to have those moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Let's move on to our next passage, which is 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 13, with the anointing of David, as it's sometimes titled. Al, what did you take away from this passage?
I mean, I think it's a really well-known passage in some ways, isn't it? It feels like one of those Sunday school stories.
Yeah.
I can almost imagine kind of a line of children being sort of pulled out and acting it out in front of me. But I guess the central point for me is this sense of how we value people, what kind of hierarchies we put in place, um, and this contrast between the kind of the dominant way of seeing people in terms of their appearance, their sense of physical strength, their kind of outward status, and this sense that God values people differently, and that God values the small and the fragile, and the overlooked, um, and we know the story from here. We know that David went on to be a great king in many ways, but also profoundly fallible. This was a man who went on to get somebody killed so he could sleep with his wife, amongst other things. So David is by no means perfect. This isn't kind of romanticizing, oh, if you're the little one, then God has great plans for you, and you're going to be innocent and perfect and utterly good and whatever. But it is saying, actually, again, look differently at people. Learn to disengage from those lenses that we're given for how to see people and how to value people, and kind of be open to be surprised by the gifts in the people around you and in front of you. I think that's
Yeah.
my takeaway.
That's great. For me, the part that stood out was actually verse 4, where the elders come before Samuel and ask, "Do you come peaceably?" And the verse said that they came trembling. So these are the civic leaders of Bethlehem. And it potentially tells us two things: that one, that they are scared, that Samuel has potentially come to condemn them for some type of wrongdoing, or maybe they're fearful of Saul and what Saul has done to tell Samuel to go and visit them. So, what does this potentially say to us about Saul's leadership as king if the first response that the civic leaders have is one of fear? So, when you contrast this to what God says to Samuel about God looking on the heart, it is a reminder to us that power, when wielded well, does not need to project its own strength. You don't need to start wars. You don't need to assassinate or abduct other countries' leaders. You don't need to bomb girls in school if you have power just to try and project a sense of strength. You don't need to do that if you lead well. And all of these projections of so-called strength are actually a sign of weakness. When you look at the other brothers that are there, some of them are described as strong, as tall, as well built, and yet they're the ones that God rejects for this kind of short, ruddy, handsome looking David, as the passage talks about. But then as a whole, if you place it within the context of First Samuel, just in the previous chapter, there's quite a difficult passage where God actually rejects Saul because he didn't completely wipe out the Amalekites. So is it also the case that potentially the writer of Samuel is assuming that power should in fact be projected through conquest and violence? So there's some interesting tensions, I think, that exist there within the passage. But for me, that line of God God does not look on the outward appearances, but looks instead on the heart is really important, especially when you see the way that the elders respond and have to ask, "Do you come peaceably?"
Mm. And that's
Mm.
interesting, isn't it? Because it links to the way Jesus is often understood and used by Christians who are entangled in power. They on one level acknowledge that the Jesus that we worship is a crucified Christ, but on the other hand, then almost kind of forget that and want to say, but ultimately he's this force of power and domination and triumph.
Mm,
And I think certainly the New Testament narrative just doesn't allow us to do that really.
yeah.
Just in the way that you described with Saul and David. Actually, the New Testament actually says that even in resurrection there's a gentleness, um, that actually this is someone who witnesses to God remaining with the powerless and refusing at any point to take up arms and slaughter people. This is decisively not who God is.
Yeah, because I think that people would maybe point to something like Revelation to try and talk about this image of Jesus as coming on a sword, on a horse with a sword coming out of his mouth. But for me, when I hear that imagery, I immediately think of Hebrews and the word of God is sharper than a double-edged sword, and that sense of the theme that you brought up in the first passage, Erica, of truth telling being an important thing there, because Revelation obviously opens with, well, not opens, but near the beginning, it talks about who is worthy to open the scrolls, and it says the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And they turn around and they don't see a roaring lion, but a slaughtered lamb. And so the whole way through, it seems to be challenging our presumptions about power. Erica, what would you add to the passage in First Samuel here?
Yeah, I was thinking about that idea of power and kind of, on the one hand, I feel like there's this image of kind of gentle forms of power, and just thinking. So yesterday, JPIT helped out with the monthly Methodist event, which is usually kind of justice themed, called Wholehearted Monthly, and we had Sarah Corbett as the special guest, who's a craftivist. And she was talking about kind of gentle protest and gentle forms of power. And I wonder if there's elements of that we can kind of get a little bit of a glimpse into from this passage as well. And then on the other hand, I was thinking about kind of more aggressive forms of power, like some of what we're seeing in the news at the moment, particularly around what's happening in the Middle East, and kind of particularly around figures like Trump, who I feel like it's not necessarily the same as in history when monarchs are drawn kind of divine right of kings and maybe link back to people like David, but actually kind of it's not that sort of kingship that we're seeing. And I really liked what Al was saying about the fallibility, even in people that are chosen who are seemingly innocent. It's not that they then go on to have perfect lives either. And kind of the humanness of our leaders, even when we're trying to elect quite good ones, they often end up under a lot of criticism. And then just thinking about kind of what's happened, particularly around like Keir Starmer, and then our upcoming local elections in May.
Yeah, and I think that comparison between gentle and more aggressive forms of power is something that also comes up maybe in our next reading of Psalm 23 when you compare it broadly to the Psalms, that actually the dominant metaphors for God in the Psalms include shield, high tower, fortress, refuge, rock, stronghold, a horn of salvation, all these things that sound very defensive, they sound very warlike, they're inanimate, they're impersonal. And yet, the imagery that we get in Psalm 23 is of the Good Shepherd, which is actually one of the countercultural images of God given within the Psalms, which is maybe one of the reasons why it's resounded with so many people for hundreds and thousands of years. So, Al, what did you take away? Psalm 23, a very well known passage.
It really is, isn't it? And I guess the danger in that is that we just kind of stick with that level of cliche with it. I guess the thing that struck me this time is that the Good Shepherd in Psalm 23, just as with the Good Shepherd when Jesus is calling himself that, is in contrast to the bad shepherds. Um, and actually, there are places like Jeremiah 23, for example, that describe the evil impact of the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. Um, God speaking, and this sense that actually, you can be entrusted with a role like shepherd to care, and that image of shepherd is used for political leaders of the people of Israel. But you can be a bad shepherd or a good shepherd. And it seems a lot of that is about how you use your power. Again, and the good shepherd seems to be one who not just has compassion for the sheep, but who understands what they need, and who has again this sense of gentleness, um, of not treating the sheep as kind of machines to produce, as not treating the sheep as kind of just a commodity to be bought and sold, but actually uh, understanding that sheep need rest and refreshment. And I guess there's an invitation in there, amongst other things, for us to push against those systems that oppress and treat people as commodities, as treat people as machines. Um, and that invitation to rest and refreshment, not just as a personal thing, but as a political longing
Hmm.
for us to work for and pray for others, to have that as well as us.
Yeah. Erica, what would you add in here?
Yeah, I was actually also kind of similarly thinking about the ideas of around rest, and kind of how this is a bit of a call to represent that kind of anti-capitalist. We are not just cogs in a machine. We are beings, whether we're sheep or human. And actually, the tendency, particularly in activist spaces, is to not rest because we're so determined to make change happen. And I think also within the church, there's a lot of overworking. There's a bit of a culture
Hmm.
of constantly working, not switching off because it's something that you're passionate about. It's your faith, it's what you're devoted to. But there is also that danger, but in activism and in faith spaces, I think of not allowing yourself that rest. So I thought that it was really interesting that you brought that out as well. And then yeah, kind of links back to those ideas about gentleness as well. One of the other verses which stood out to me a bit as well was, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And just thinking about how we still need to, as churches, occupy those spaces where we are in dialogue with people that think differently, and kind of the difficulty of navigating that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, that first point you made about rest, and how in the activist sphere that's generally something that we don't do well. And I think it connects well to what Al was saying about not just resting individually but communally. Um, Being part of the Iona community, one of the things that we talk about regularly is that none of us can do the work of justice and peace on our own, and that actually the benefit of being part of a community that works for justice and peace is that when one of us, if we can focus maybe on one or two things, which is why they have the common concern network. So you might be able to focus on environmental concerns, or you might be able to focus on inequality and poverty, but you can't focus on everything that's there. But as a community, we can. And so we can do that work. And when one is resting, the other is working, and recognizing that there's this reciprocal and communal relationship that exists within that. I don't know if either of you want to add anything else onto those thoughts there?
I think it sparked a memory of Tricia Hersey and the Nap Ministry in the States as a movement primarily led by black women um, who were saying that rest is resistance, precisely as you were saying, Erica, kind of resistance against the capitalist machine. I've just found a quote from Tricia Hersey's book where she says, "By putting people to sleep, we are waking them up. How can you begin to disconnect from the lies of grind culture enough to fall into a moment of dreaming?" That sense, again, that collectivity that you're talking about, well, as well. Um, Actually, how can we learn collectively to find rest in ways that deepen our solidarities together,
Yeah.
in ways that resist the pressures of the systems that want to co-opt us, but also in ways to make space for to be able to dream of a better world, to be able to dream of God's kingdom, and to be inspired to creatively pursue it. I was going to say work for it, but I'm kind of now wanting to resist
Yeah.
that word.
Yeah. So Psalm 23 is actually the passage that I'll be preaching on this Sunday. And I'm actually going to be focusing in on some aspects of Women's History Month and also for Mothering Sunday, because although it's a very popular psalm, a lot of the times people maybe miss the feminine imagery of God that can be found in the passage. There's some really good stuff in Kenneth Bailey's book on this, just called The Good Shepherd, which traces the history of the imagery of God as a shepherd throughout the scriptures, from Psalm 23 right through to the New Testament, and looks at how this develops. And he talks about how there's three dominant countercultural images of God in the Psalms. You have God as a shepherd in Psalm 23, God being like a mother in Psalm 131, and God being like a father in Psalm 103. And he goes on to point out that Psalm 23 says that God prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies, and that in traditional Middle Eastern society, that the role of preparing food is the role of woman. For example, in Proverbs 9, wisdom is described as preparing her table, and in Genesis 18, when Abraham and Sarah have angelic visitors, Sarah is the one who prepares cakes for them. And so Bailey highlights that this imagery of a good hostess is actually a common theme in passages about God as a good shepherd throughout Scripture, ultimately coming to the trilogy of parables given by Jesus in Luke 15 that center on God as three things: a good shepherd, a good woman, and a good father. Jesus is familiar with the images of God offered in the Psalms and opts to highlight these countercultural images. So, exploring these feminine depictions of God in Scripture could be a useful thing for you to explore this Mothering Sunday, although it's important not to imply from the passages that therefore traditional gender roles are maintained around things like food prep and things like that. But actually, just being able to draw out that there is feminine language about God, even in such a well-known psalm, could be really good for a lot of people to realize. Right, well, we will move on to our final reading for today, which comes from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 to 14. Al, what were your thoughts on this?
So I think that this feels like my coda, so I've not got a huge amount to say. But yeah, going back to the beginning and just being a little bit cautious about our darkness and light binary. But I think two things really struck me. And again, in the midst of some of the news of this week about things that have been hidden being exposed, that sense, I remember some words of the one of our previous archbishops in the Church of England, Rowan Williams, who picks up on that image of the cold light of day as being something that can be kind of exposing and shaming, and suggests that the light of Christ doesn't shame in that sense, but it does bring to visibility all that we are, which means that the bad stuff that we wanted to hide is brought to visibility, but also maybe the bits of us that we fail to notice and value as well, that God values, are brought into visibility as well. So there's a democracy of becoming visible in this, I guess, was one thought. And then that final line of verse 14, sleep awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Again, we're used to the word woke being weaponized in certain quarters as something that that is bad, or to be held in contempt. But here's the Bible yet again inviting us to wake up, to be awake, to be woke, to be awake, not just to the evil in the world, and to be wise and discerning about those things, but also to be awake to the goodness that God is doing in the world as well.
Yeah, and for me, I think that links nicely to what Erica was saying earlier about the passage in John about truth telling and being able to see things clearly, because there's that verse that talks about the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. So truth is a fruit of the light, and truth telling then is an important work in the world of misinformation and corruption. So Erica, I'm presuming that might be where you might go again with this, but did you pick out anything else from that?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what you both said, really. And then I suppose in the most sort of blunt way, I think that we can see many of the unfruitful works of darkness quite clearly, or at least those of us that are working in the political and activist spaces can see them, whether it's fascism, neocolonialism, misogyny, racism, all of those injustices that we're seeing, and we do, like you say, Al, like we desperately need our churches and our society to wake up to it. We did have a lovely Substack post fairly recently, which was writing about the JPIT denominations and calling us all woke. But based on your definition, that's not the worst thing in the world if we are.
Yeah, and I think like one thing for me recently that we see a lot of headlines a lot of the time that maybe talk about some ridiculous things that people that are in power have decided to do. But then maybe we aren't as connected to the actual impact of those things, whether it's a war zone, we're not actually there experiencing it. But one thing recently that felt very much like standing in the cold light of day and seeing the impact of some decisions that were made months ago around the cutting of US aid, was that I was in Geneva recently, and as we spoke with the World Council of Churches, as we travelled by the UN, as we spoke to local businesses, as we spoke to local churches, we heard about how many people just weren't in the city because the buildings were at 25% occupancy, because the work of diplomacy, the work of peacemaking, of justice, of aid organizations has been so severely impacted by things like USAID being cut. And actually, as a percentage, the UK has cut their aid to a greater extent than the USAID cut has been as a percentage of what they give. And so countries all over are investing massive amounts of money into war and then cutting these funds elsewhere. And so standing there in Geneva, when you can look in one direction and see the WHO, look in the other, see the UN, you can look in the other direction and see the World Council of Churches. Standing there and just seeing how empty it felt to usual felt very much like those those fruits of darkness being exposed to the light of day, of seeing how this actually has an impact on people's day-to-day lives and what can actually be done through these international organizations. But before we close, Erica, would you like to give any concluding or summarizing thoughts for our passages for today?
I think it's been a really interesting conversation. I think definitely the themes around sort of power and different forms of power, whether that's gentle or aggressive, have really stood out. And I think, we just need to try and do our best to see where we can speak into either gentle forms of power or challenging the more aggressive, expansive kinds. And I think these passages really clearly show that we do have a role in that, and that it is relevant to our Christian lives, as well as in wider society.
Yeah. And Al, what about yourself?
I think I'm left with a story. It's actually a story I used last week, so I'm not going to use it again here. But it's the story of the rabbi who asks his students, "How do we know that night has ended and day has begun?" And his students come up with all kinds of answers that are about kind of being able to tell one thing from another thing. And the rabbi says at the end, when you look into the face of the person who's beside you and you can see that that person is your brother or your sister, then you know finally that night has ended and day has begun. And I'm left with that story as an invitation and a challenge, I think, to find more ways of both being able to see those around me as my brother and sister, and also inviting others to do the same.
I love that. Well, thank you, Al, and thank you, Erica, both for this wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed our time together. And thank you to you, the listener. I hope that this episode helps in your preaching prep. If you enjoyed this episode, then please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. As we close today, may we remember that God looks not upon our outward appearance, but on our hearts. May we then, in vulnerability and reliance upon God, allow God to care for us as our good shepherd, our good mother, our good father. May we find rest for our souls, and may the fruit of the light be found in us, all that is good, all that is right, all that is true. And may we, like the blind man, recognize Jesus for who he is, the one who calls those of us who are asleep to awake and to arise from the dead and let his light shine upon us. Have a good one.